The thunderstorm had been building all day across the Montana sky, and by 10 o'clock that night, rain hammered against the windows of Samuel Morrison's cabin like angry fists demanding entry. At 62 years old, Samuel had grown accustomed to the isolation of his 1,000-acre ranch, but tonight felt different somehow. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding his property with an almost human voice, and even his old German shepherd, Rex, paced restlessly near the fireplace instead of settling into his usual evening nap. Samuel sat in his leather armchair, trying to concentrate on the ranch ledgers spread across his lap, but the numbers kept blurring together. His mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with his foreman, Jake Martinez, earlier that afternoon. Jake had mentioned seeing smoke rising from the old Henderson place about 5 miles east, the abandoned homestead that had sat empty for nearly 3 years since old Bill Henderson passed away. Samuel had dismissed it as probably just lightning striking a dead tree, but now he wondered if maybe some drifters had taken shelter there. The coffee in his mug had grown cold, and he was about to get up to pour a fresh cup when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. Rex immediately jumped to his feet, his ears perked forward, but surprisingly he didn't bark. Instead, the dog whined softly and padded toward the front door, his tail wagging uncertainly. Samuel checked his watch. 11:58. Who in their right mind would be out in weather like this? His nearest neighbor, the Kowalski family, lived 12 miles away, and they would have called if there was an emergency. He'd installed a phone line to their place just 2 years ago specifically for such situations. His own grown children lived in cities hundreds of miles away, and none of them would make the drive to his remote ranch without calling first. He set the ledgers aside and walked to the window beside the door, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer outside. The porch light illuminated sheets of rain but revealed nothing else. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, and Rex whined louder. "Who's there?" Samuel called through the thick wooden door, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. Living alone in such an isolated area, a man learned to be cautious, especially after dark. "Please, sir." The voice that came back was barely audible over the storm, high and trembling. "I need help." It was a young voice, definitely female, and filled with such desperation that Samuel felt his heart clench. He'd been raised by parents who believed in helping those in need, no matter the circumstances. His father, God rest his soul, had once taken in a family of strangers during a blizzard, and they'd stayed for 3 weeks until the roads cleared. But that had been different times, when people could trust one another more easily. Samuel grabbed his heavy flashlight from the shelf and unlocked the door, opening it just enough to see outside. The beam of light revealed a sight that made him gasp and immediately pull the door wide open. A young girl, probably no more than 16 or 17, stood on his porch soaking wet and shivering violently. Her clothes hung in tatters, more holes than fabric, and her dark hair was plastered to her skull. She was painfully thin, so much so that her cheekbones jutted out prominently, and her eyes seemed too large for her gaunt face. Most shocking of all, her feet were bare, cut, and bleeding from what must have been miles of walking through rough terrain. "Dear Lord," Samuel breathed, reaching out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. "Come in, child, come in right now." She stumbled across the threshold, and Samuel quickly closed the door behind her, shutting out the howling wind. In the warm light of his living room, she looked even worse than she had on the porch. Her skin had a grayish pallor, and he could see her ribs through the holes in her torn shirt. When was the last time this girl had eaten a proper meal? "Rex, go lay down," Samuel commanded gently, and the dog obediently retreated to his bed by the fireplace, though he kept his eyes fixed on their unexpected visitor. "Sit down, please," Samuel said, guiding her to the couch nearest the fire. "Let me get you a blanket and something hot to drink." The girl nodded gratefully but didn't speak. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the flames in the fireplace as if she'd never seen anything so beautiful. Samuel hurried to his bedroom and grabbed the thickest quilt he owned, the one his late wife Margaret had made during their early years of marriage. He wrapped it carefully around the girl's shoulders, noticing how she flinched slightly when he moved too quickly. "I'm going to make you some hot cocoa," he said, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. "And I think I have some soup in the kitchen. When did you last eat?" 3 days ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe 4, I lost track." Samuel felt anger surge through him, not at the girl, but at whatever circumstances had led to a child being in such a desperate state. 4 days without food? In his mind, he was already planning what he would give her to eat. He had beef stew left over from dinner, fresh bread, milk, and plenty of other supplies. But he knew he'd have to be careful not to overwhelm her system if she'd been starving. "What's your name, child?" he asked, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "Emma," she replied, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were a striking blue, almost violet in the firelight, but they held a wariness that no child should possess. "Well, Emma, I'm Samuel Morrison, and this is my ranch. You're safe here, I promise you that. Now let me get you something to eat, and we can talk about what brought you to my door on a night like this." In the kitchen, Samuel moved quickly but quietly, heating up a bowl of the beef stew and cutting several thick slices of bread. He made sure the food wasn't too hot that might burn her mouth, but warm enough to help chase away the chill that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. He also poured a large glass of milk and prepared a mug of hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. When he returned to the living room, he found Emma exactly where he'd left her, staring into the fire. She turned when she heard him approaching, and her eyes widened at the sight of the food. For a moment, he thought she might cry, but she held herself together with remarkable composure for someone so young. "Here you go," Samuel said, setting the food on the coffee table in front of her. "Take your time, don't eat too fast. Your stomach needs to remember what food feels like." Emma nodded and picked up the spoon with hands that shook from more than just cold. She took a small sip of the broth first, closed her eyes, and made a small sound of pleasure. Then she began eating with careful, measured bites, though Samuel could see how much willpower it took for her to pace herself when she was clearly starving. While she ate, Samuel studied her more closely. Despite her current condition, he could see that she came from good stock. Her bone structure suggested she would be quite beautiful when healthy, and there was an intelligence in her eyes that spoke of education and upbringing. Her hands, though dirty and scratched, were well formed with long, elegant fingers. This wasn't a child who had grown up on the streets. "Emma," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her, "can you tell me how you came to be out there tonight? Are you running from something?" She paused in her eating, the spoon halfway to her mouth, and Samuel saw fear flicker across her features. She set the spoon down carefully and looked at him with those two old eyes. "My stepfather," she said simply, and those two words explained everything and nothing at all. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen enough of the world to know what that usually meant when a young girl ran away from home. "Did he hurt you?" Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her left side, and she winced slightly. "Not in the way you might think," she said carefully, "but yes, he hurt me." "Where's your mother?" "She died 6 months ago, cancer." Emma's voice became even smaller. "After the funeral, everything changed. He started drinking more and he looked at me differently." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, and he had to take a deep breath to keep his voice steady. "How long have you been running?" 2 weeks, Emma replied, returning to her soup. "I had some money saved from my job at the diner in town, but it ran out 5 days ago. I've been walking ever since, sleeping wherever I could find shelter." "What town?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Cedar Falls," she confirmed, "about 60 miles south of here." Samuel knew Cedar Falls well. It was a small community, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business. If this girl had disappeared 2 weeks ago, people would be talking about it. He made a mental note to drive into town tomorrow and listen to what folks might be saying. "Emma, I want you to know that you can stay here as long as you need to," he said, watching her face carefully. "I have plenty of room, plenty of food, and I give you my word that you'll be safe. But I need to know, is anyone looking for you? Are the police involved?" Emma shook her head quickly. "He told everyone I went to stay with my aunt in California. He has letters that he says are from me, telling everyone I'm doing fine in school out there and that I don't want to come back." "But you don't have an aunt in California." "No," Emma said quietly. "My mother's only sister died when I was little, and my father's family disowned him when he married my mother. She was Mexican, and they didn't approve." Samuel processed this information carefully. If her stepfather had covered his tracks this thoroughly, it meant Emma was probably not being actively searched for by law enforcement. But it also meant the man was calculating and dangerous, which made Samuel even more determined to protect her. "What's his name?" Samuel asked. "Robert Hawkins. He owns the feed store in Cedar Falls and serves on the town council." Emma's voice carried a bitter edge. Everyone thinks he's such a good man, such a pillar of the community. They have no idea what he's really like. Samuel knew the name. He'd done business with Hawkins Feed and Supply several times over the years, though he'd always preferred dealing with the elderly man who'd owned it before Robert Hawkins took over. He remembered Hawkins as a smooth-talking man with cold eyes and a smile that never seemed quite genuine. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth," Samuel said, leaning forward slightly. "Did he ever actually touch you inappropriately, or was it more threats and intimidation?" The girl was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel could see her wrestling with whether to trust him with the complete truth. Finally, she spoke. "Both," she said simply. "It started with looks and comments after my mother got sick. Then after the funeral, he started finding excuses to come into my room at night. He said since he was taking care of me, I owed him. The night I left, he tried to. He said it was time I showed him proper gratitude." Samuel's vision went red for a moment, and he had to grip the arms of his chair to keep from standing up and packing. The idea of a grown man threatening a grieving child made him physically ill. "You did the right thing running," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And you were smart to get so far away." "I didn't feel smart," Emma admitted, managing a small smile. "I felt scared and cold and hungry. I thought maybe I'd made a terrible mistake, leaving the only home I'd ever known." "You didn't make a mistake," Samuel assured her firmly. "You saved yourself, and that took tremendous courage." Emma finished her soup and bread, and Samuel could already see some color returning to her pale cheeks. She drank the milk slowly, savoring each sip, and when she was done, she leaned back against the couch with a sigh of contentment. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I don't know how to thank you. I've been walking for so long, and when I saw the light from your cabin, I almost didn't have the courage to knock. I thought you might turn me away." "What made you decide to try anyway?" Emma looked down at her hands. "I heard your dog barking earlier when I was still a ways off. But it wasn't a mean bark, it was more like he was just letting you know someone was coming. And then when I got closer, I could see through the window that you were reading. My father used to read by the fire like that before he died. It made me think maybe you might be a kind person." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best," Emma said softly. "He taught me to read when I was 4, showed me how to identify different plants and animals, and he always said that a person's character was the only thing that really mattered in this world. I think he would have liked you." "I think I would have liked him too," Samuel replied. "What did he do for work?" "He was a teacher at the elementary school. He also wrote stories for children's books, though he never got any published. After he died, my mother had to work 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and that's when she met Robert." Emma's expression darkened. "She was lonely and scared about money, and he swooped in like some kind of hero, offering to take care of everything." "How old were you when your father died?" 12. It's been 5 years, but I still miss him every day." Samuel could hear the love and loss in her voice, and it made him think of his own children, now grown and living their own lives in distant cities. When was the last time he'd seen them? Christmas, nearly a year ago. They called occasionally, but they had their own families and responsibilities now. "Emma, I have a guest room that's been sitting empty for too long," he said. "It has its own bathroom, clean sheets, and warm quilts. Why don't you get cleaned up and get some rest? Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." "You really mean it?" she asked, hope and disbelief warring in her voice. "You'll let me stay?" "For as long as you need," Samuel confirmed. "But first, let me take a look at those cuts on your feet. We need to get them cleaned and bandaged before they get infected." Samuel retrieved his first aid kit from the bathroom and knelt beside the couch. Emma's feet were in worse condition than he'd initially thought. The cuts were deep in several places, and there were thorns embedded in her heels from walking through brush. As gently as possible, he cleaned the wounds with antiseptic and removed the debris, apologizing each time she winced. "You've been walking on these for how long?" he asked as he wrapped her feet in clean gauze. "Since this morning," Emma admitted. "My shoes fell apart yesterday, and I couldn't find anything to replace them. I tried wrapping them with pieces of my shirt, but that didn't last long." "Well, you won't be doing any more walking for a while," Samuel said firmly. "These need time to heal properly." When he was finished bandaging her feet, Samuel showed Emma to the guest room. It was a cozy space with a double bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the pasture where his horses grazed during the day. He found some clean clothes that had belonged to his daughter Sarah when she was younger, though they would probably be too big for Emma's current thin frame. "The bathroom is right through that door," he explained. "There are fresh towels in the cabinet, and I put some soap and shampoo on the counter. Take as long as you need for a hot shower and don't worry about using up all the hot water. I have a good system here." Emma stood in the doorway, looking around the room with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Mr. Morrison," she said, turning to face him, "why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me." Samuel thought about that for a moment. Why was he being so kind? Part of it was his upbringing, certainly. His parents had taught him to help those in need. Part of it was his own experience as a father and the thought that somewhere out there, someone might need to help one of his children someday. But mostly, it was something simpler and more fundamental. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because no child should have to face the world alone." Emma's eyes filled with tears then, the first he'd seen her shed since she'd arrived. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get some rest," Samuel said gently. "We'll talk more tomorrow." He closed the door and made his way back to the living room, where Rex was still lying by the fire, watching him with knowing eyes. "What do you think, old boy?" Samuel asked, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Think we can help her?" Rex wagged his tail and laid his head back down, apparently satisfied with the evening's developments. Samuel banked the fire and turned off most of the lights, but he left a lamp burning in the living room in case Emma needed anything during the night. As he made his way to his own bedroom, he could hear the shower running, and he found himself hoping that the hot water would wash away more than just the dirt and exhaustion of her long journey. He lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm begin to subside outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions. He would need to think carefully about the best way to help Emma, both in the short term and the long run. She was clearly intelligent and resilient, but she was also traumatized and vulnerable. Whatever happened next, he was determined to make sure she never had to go back to the man who had driven her to such desperate measures. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Samuel found himself thinking about his late wife, Margaret. She would have loved having a young person in the house again, would have immediately started planning how to help Emma rebuild her life. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, telling him that sometimes God sent people into your life not just so you could help them, but so they could help you too. Outside, the last rumbles of thunder faded into the distance, and the Montana sky began to clear, revealing stars that seemed to shine a little brighter than usual. Samuel woke at dawn to the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying, which struck him as odd since he lived alone and rarely ate breakfast beyond a piece of toast and black coffee. For a moment, he lay in bed confused, wondering if he'd been dreaming. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and he smiled despite himself. Emma was awake and apparently feeling well enough to cook. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found her standing at the stove wearing his daughter's old clothes. The jeans hung loose on her thin frame, held up by an old belt he'd found for her, and the flannel shirt practically swallowed her whole. Her dark hair was clean and braided back from her face, and already she looked like a completely different person than the desperate waif who had appeared on his porch 12 hours earlier. "Good morning," she said, turning to smile at him. "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed your kitchen. I wanted to make you breakfast as a small way to say thank you." "Mind, I can't remember the last time I woke up to someone cooking in my kitchen," Samuel replied, settling into a chair at the small dining table. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in weeks," Emma admitted, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "That shower was like heaven, and sleeping in a real bed with clean sheets. I'd forgotten how good that could feel." Samuel watched her move around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, considering she'd never been there before. She'd found everything she needed and was cooking as if she'd been doing it her whole life. The eggs were perfectly scrambled, the bacon was crispy but not burnt, and she'd even managed to make fresh biscuits from scratch. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked as she set a plate in front of him. "My mother taught me when I was little, and then I worked at Murphy's Diner for 2 years after school and on weekends," Emma explained, settling into the chair across from him with her own plate. "Mrs. Murphy said I had a natural talent for it." The food was excellent, better than anything Samuel had made for himself in years. As they ate, Emma told him more about her life before everything fell apart. She'd been a good student, earning mostly A's and planning to apply for college scholarships. She'd wanted to study literature and maybe become a teacher like her father. Her job at the diner had been helping her save money for college expenses that scholarships wouldn't cover. "What grade were you in when you left?" Samuel asked. "I should have been a senior this year," Emma said quietly. "I was supposed to graduate in May and start college in the fall. I had everything planned out." Samuel heard the grief in her voice, not just for the life she'd lost, but for the future that had been stolen from her. 17 years old, and already she'd faced more hardship than many people experienced in a lifetime. "Emma, what I'm about to suggest might sound crazy," Samuel said, setting down his coffee cup. "But I want you to hear me out. What if you didn't have to give up on those plans?" She looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you could finish high school and still go to college? What if running away doesn't have to mean the end of your education?" Emma shook her head slowly. "Mr. Morrison, that's very kind, but it's not possible. I don't have any way to prove who I am, no transcripts, no records. Robert probably destroyed everything after I left, and even if he didn't, I can't go back there to get them." "What if you didn't have to go back?" Samuel asked. "What if there were other ways?" "I don't understand." Samuel had been thinking about this since he'd woken up, and the more he considered it, the more convinced he became that it could work. "Emma, I've lived in Montana for 40 years, and I've got friends and connections all over the state. My lawyer, David Chen, has been helping me with legal matters for 15 years, and he's handled some unusual situations before. I think there might be ways to get copies of your school records without involving your stepfather directly." Emma's eyes widened. "You really think that's possible?" "I think it's worth exploring. David also knows people in the state education department. There might be options for someone in your situation, ways to complete your education that don't require going through traditional channels." "But even if we could figure out the school part," Emma said, her practical nature asserting itself, "I don't have anywhere to live, no money for college, no family to help me." Samuel took a deep breath. "What if I told you that wouldn't be a problem?" Emma stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "Mr. Morrison, I can't let you support me," she said finally. "You've already done too much, and I won't be a burden on someone I barely know." "Emma, let me tell you something about myself," Samuel said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm 62 years old, I own a 1,000-acre ranch that's paid for, and I have more money than I know what to do with. My late wife and I were never able to have children of our own, so we adopted 2 kids, Sarah and Michael. They're both grown now with families of their own, living in Chicago and Seattle, respectively." He paused, looking out the window at his land, stretching toward the mountains in the distance. "This ranch has been successful beyond anything I ever dreamed when I started it 40 years ago. I've got prize-winning cattle, some of the best horses in the state, and investments that ensure I'll never want for anything. But you know what I don't have? Purpose. Someone to share it with, someone who actually needs what I have to offer." Emma was quiet, and Samuel could see tears forming in her eyes. "I'm not offering charity," he continued. "I'm offering opportunity. You work hard, you're smart, you've got good character, and you've proven you're a survivor. If you're willing to work on this ranch, learn the business, and continue your education, then I'm willing to provide room and board and help with college expenses." "Why would you do this for me?" Emma whispered. "Because 40 years ago, a man named Frank Peterson took a chance on a young man who didn't have anything but a willingness to work hard. Frank owned this ranch back then, and I was just a kid from town whose father had died, leaving my mother with 3 children and no money. Frank hired me as a ranch hand, taught me everything he knew about cattle and horses and land management. When he retired, he sold me the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth and carried the note himself." Samuel smiled at the memory. "Frank used to say that a man's true wealth wasn't measured by what he accumulated, but by what he passed on to others. I never understood what he meant until I got older and realized that all the money in the world doesn't mean much if you don't have anyone to share it with or anyone to help along the way." "What happened to Frank?" Emma asked. "He lived to be 92 and died peacefully in his sleep about 10 years ago. Right up until the end, he would tell anyone who'd listen that the best investment he ever made was in people, not property." Emma was crying openly now, and Samuel reached across the table to pat her hand gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "Take some time to think about it. But Emma, I want you to understand something. This isn't about me doing you a favor. You'd be doing me one. This place is too big and too quiet for one old man and his dog." They were interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling up outside. Samuel looked out the window and saw Jake Martinez climbing out of his pickup, right on schedule for their daily morning meeting about ranch operations. "That's Jake, my foreman," Samuel explained to Emma. "He's a good man, been working here for 8 years. His family lives in the bunkhouse about half a mile from here." "Should I go to my room?" Emma asked, suddenly looking uncertain. "Absolutely not," Samuel said firmly. "If you're going to be staying here, you'll need to meet the people who work on the ranch. Besides, Jake is discreet and trustworthy. If I decide to tell him your story, you can count on him to keep it to himself." Jake knocked on the kitchen door and Samuel called for him to come in. The foreman was a man in his 30s with weathered hands and kind eyes, married to a schoolteacher named Maria and father to 3 young children. He stopped short when he saw Emma, his eyes taking in her too thin frame and the way she seemed to shrink back into her chair. "Jake, I'd like you to meet Emma," Samuel said smoothly. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping out around the ranch." Jake nodded politely and touched the brim of his hat. "Pleased to meet you, miss. I'm Jake Martinez." "Hello," Emma replied quietly, but she managed to meet his eyes. "Emma, Jake and I need to discuss some ranch business," Samuel said. "Would you mind cleaning up the breakfast dishes? I promise we won't be long." Emma nodded and began clearing the table, moving quietly but efficiently. Samuel and Jake stepped outside onto the porch to have their usual morning conversation about which cattle needed to be moved, fence repairs that needed attention, and the status of the hay crop in the north pasture. "Boss," Jake said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that Emma couldn't hear through the kitchen window, "I don't mean to pry, but that girl looks like she's been through hell. Is she in some kind of trouble?" Samuel had expected the question. Jake was observant and protective by nature, and he'd immediately noticed Emma's condition despite her obvious efforts to clean herself up. "She's running from a bad situation," Samuel said carefully. "Nothing illegal on her part, but she needed a safe place to stay. I thought maybe we could put her to work helping Maria with the vegetable garden and doing some light work around the house." Jake nodded slowly. "Maria's been saying she could use help with the garden, and Lord knows you could use someone to cook proper meals instead of living on sandwiches and canned soup." "You think Maria would be okay with having another woman around?" "Are you kidding? She's been after me for months to convince you to hire some household help. She worries about you rattling around in that big house all by yourself." This was news to Samuel, though it shouldn't have been surprising. Maria Martinez was a nurturing soul who had essentially adopted him as an honorary uncle to her children. She brought him meals when she thought he wasn't eating properly and always made sure he was invited to family celebrations. "There's something else," Samuel said, watching Emma through the window as she washed dishes. "The girl is smart, Jake, really smart. She should be finishing high school and going to college, but circumstances have prevented that. I'm thinking about helping her get her education back on track." Jake studied his boss's face carefully. In the 8 years he'd worked for Samuel Morrison, he'd learned to read the man's moods and motivations. What he saw now was determination mixed with something that looked almost like hope. "You're thinking of making this permanent," Jake said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm thinking of giving her options," Samuel replied. "This ranch will be worth millions someday, and right now I don't have anyone to leave it to. My adopted kids have their own lives in the city. They don't want anything to do with ranching. Maybe it's time I found someone who does." "Boss, you've known this girl for less than 24 hours. Frank Peterson knew me for less than 24 hours when he offered me a job," Samuel pointed out. "Sometimes you just know when someone's worth taking a chance on." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "What do you need from me?" "Keep an eye on her, but don't make it obvious. If she's going to work here, she'll need to learn about the ranch, and I can't teach her everything myself. Also, I'd appreciate it if you'd ask Maria to befriend her. Emma's been on her own for too long. She needs to remember what it feels like to have people care about her." "Consider it done," Jake said. "Anything else?" "Yeah, if anyone comes around asking questions about a young woman, you've never seen her. Emma is running from someone who hurt her, and I won't have him tracking her down here." Jake's expression grew serious. "Understood, we'll keep her safe." They finished their business discussion, and Jake headed out to begin his day's work. Samuel found Emma in the kitchen, having finished the dishes and now standing uncertainly by the window, watching Jake drive toward the cattle pens. He seems nice, she said. Jake's one of the best men I know, Samuel confirmed. His wife Maria teaches at the elementary school in town and they have 3 kids. I think you'd like them. Mr. Morrison, Emma said, turning to face him, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about staying here and finishing school. I want you to know how grateful I am for the offer, but I'm scared. What are you scared of? Emma wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture Samuel was beginning to recognize as something she did when she felt vulnerable. I'm scared that this is too good to be true, she admitted. I'm scared that you'll change your mind, or that Robert will somehow find me, or that I'll disappoint you and you'll regret helping me. Samuel nodded, understanding her fears completely. After everything she'd been through, it would be natural for her to have trouble trusting in good fortune. Emma, I'm not going to lie to you and say there are no risks, he said. Life is unpredictable, and I can't guarantee that everything will work out perfectly. But I can promise you this. As long as you're willing to work hard and be honest with me, you'll have a home here. And if your stepfather somehow tracks you down, he'll have to go through me to get to you. You don't know Robert, Emma said, fear creeping into her voice. He's not just mean, he's smart and manipulative. He has friends in law enforcement, people who owe him favors, if he decides he wants me back. Emma, look at me, Samuel said firmly. When she met his eyes, he continued. I may be just one old rancher, but I've got resources too. I've got friends in high places, a good lawyer, and enough money to fight whatever battles need fighting. More importantly, I've got 40 years of experience dealing with bullies, and I've learned that most of them back down when they realize their target isn't as helpless as they thought. Emma studied his face, and Samuel could see her trying to decide whether to trust what he was telling her. Besides, he added with a slight smile, you're not the same frightened girl who ran away 2 weeks ago. You've proven you're stronger than you knew, and now you're not alone anymore. Okay, Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd like to try if you're really sure about this. I'm sure, Samuel said. Now, let's go for a walk around the ranch so you can start learning what this place is all about. They spent the morning exploring the property, with Samuel explaining the different aspects of ranch operations. Emma asked intelligent questions and showed genuine interest in everything from cattle breeding to water management. She had a quick mind and seemed to instinctively understand the complex relationships between land, animals, and weather that made ranching successful. At the horse pasture, they stopped to watch the mares and their foals grazing in the morning sunshine. Emma was enchanted by a small Palomino filly who kept running in circles around her mother, full of energy and curiosity. That's Starlight, Samuel said. She was born just 2 months ago. Her mother, Sunshine, is one of our best quarter horses. She's beautiful, Emma breathed, leaning against the fence rail. I've never been this close to horses before. Would you like to meet her? Emma's eyes widened. Is that safe? With the right approach, yes. Horses are prey animals, so they're naturally cautious, but they're also curious and social. If we're calm and respectful, Sunshine will probably let us get close to her baby. Samuel opened the gate and led Emma into the pasture, moving slowly and speaking softly. Sunshine raised her head and watched them approach, but she didn't move away. When they were about 10 feet away, Samuel stopped and held out his hand, letting the mare catch their scent. Hold out your hand like this, he instructed Emma. Let her decide if she wants to come to us. After a few moments, Sunshine stepped forward and gently sniffed Emma's hand. The filly, emboldened by her mother's acceptance, came prancing over to investigate these new visitors. Emma laughed with delight when the little horse nuzzled her palm, searching for treats. She's so soft. Horses are good judges of character, Samuel said, watching Emma's face light up with joy. They can sense when someone has a gentle spirit. They spent nearly an hour with the horses, and Samuel could see Emma beginning to relax in a way he hadn't witnessed since she'd arrived. The simple pleasure of interacting with the animals seemed to remind her that the world could be kind and beautiful, not just dangerous and threatening. On the walk back to the house, Emma was quieter, but it was a thoughtful quiet rather than a fearful one. Mr. Morrison, she said as they approached the cabin, if I do stay here and work on the ranch, what exactly would my duties be? Well, that depends partly on what interests you, Samuel replied. There's always work to be done with the animals, maintaining equipment, helping with the bookkeeping, cooking, and cleaning. During certain seasons, we'll need help with roundups and moving cattle, and if you're serious about finishing your education, we'll need to work around school schedules. I'd like to learn everything, Emma said earnestly. I don't want to be just a house helper or just work with animals. I want to understand how the whole operation works. Samuel smiled. That was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. That's ambitious, he said. Ranch management involves everything from animal husbandry to financial planning to marketing. It takes years to learn it all properly. I've got time, Emma said simply, and I'm a fast learner. That afternoon, Samuel drove into town to have lunch at Murphy's diner, both to get a feel for what people might be saying about Emma's disappearance and to reacquaint himself with her former workplace. The diner was busy with the usual crowd of ranchers, truckers, and townspeople, and Samuel settled into a corner booth where he could listen to conversations without being too obvious about it. Mrs. Murphy herself came over to take his order, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and kind eyes who had been running the diner for over 20 years. "Samuel Morrison," she exclaimed. "It's been too long since you've graced us with your presence. What brings you to town on a Thursday afternoon?" "Just felt like getting out for a change," Samuel said. "The ranch has been keeping me busy, but sometimes a man needs to remember what civilization looks like." They chatted about mutual acquaintances and local news while Samuel ate his lunch, but he didn't hear Emma's name mentioned once. Either people weren't talking about her disappearance, or they were being more discreet about it than usual small-town gossip would suggest. As Mrs. Murphy refilled his coffee, Samuel decided to take a chance. "I thought I heard that one of your waitresses left town recently," he said casually. "Emma something, used to see her here when I came in." Mrs. Murphy's expression immediately grew sad. "Oh yes, Emma Rodriguez, such a sweet girl, that one. Lost her mother earlier this year, poor thing. Her stepfather said she went to live with relatives in California after graduation. I sure hated to lose her. She was one of my best workers." "Graduation?" Samuel asked, confused. Emma had told him she was supposed to be a senior this year. "Well, early graduation," Mrs. Murphy clarified. "Mr. Hawkins said she was so smart that the school let her finish early so she could start college right away. Can't say I was surprised. That girl had more brains in her little finger than most folks have in their whole heads." Samuel filed this information away for later consideration. It seemed that Robert Hawkins had constructed an elaborate lie to explain Emma's absence, which suggested he was definitely trying to avoid scrutiny of her disappearance. The drive back to the ranch gave Samuel time to think about everything he'd learned. Emma's stepfather was clearly a dangerous man who had planned carefully to cover his tracks. But the fact that he'd gone to such lengths to create a plausible story for her absence also suggested that he might not be actively searching for her. As long as people believed she was safe and happy in California, he could maintain his reputation in the community. When Samuel arrived home, he found Emma in the kitchen with Maria Martinez and two of the Martinez children. Maria was teaching Emma how to make fresh tortillas, while 7-year-old Sophia chattered about her school day, and 5-year-old Miguel played with toy trucks on the floor. "Samuel," Maria called out when she saw him, "I hope you don't mind that I brought the kids over. Jake told me you had a new helper and I wanted to meet her." "Of course I don't mind," Samuel said, genuinely pleased to see Emma laughing at something Sophia had said. She looked more relaxed than he'd seen her yet, and the children had clearly taken to her immediately. "Emma's been telling us about her garden back home," Maria continued. "She knows so much about vegetables and herbs, I think she could teach me a few things." Emma blushed at the compliment. "I just helped my mother with her garden when I was little. She grew up on her grandfather's farm in New Mexico, and she taught me everything she learned from him." The evening passed pleasantly, with Maria and the children staying for dinner. Emma proved to be wonderful with kids, patient and playful in a way that suggested she'd spent time around children before. When it came time for the Martinez family to head home, both children begged Emma to come visit them soon. After they left, Emma helped Samuel clean up the kitchen, moving around each other with an easy familiarity that belied the fact that they'd known each other for less than 2 days. "Maria seems really nice," Emma said as she dried the last plate, "and her children are adorable." "Maria's been like family to me since Jake started working here," Samuel agreed. "She's got a big heart and a practical head on her shoulders. I'm glad you like her." "Mr. Morrison," Emma said, hanging up the dish towel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Are you really sure about this arrangement? Really, truly sure? Because I've been thinking all day about what you're offering, and it seems too generous. I keep wondering if there's something I'm not understanding, some catch or condition that you haven't mentioned. Samuel considered his answer carefully. Emma deserved complete honesty, especially given what she'd endured with her stepfather. Emma, I won't lie to you. Part of me is taking a leap of faith here. I don't know you well enough yet to know if this will work out long-term. You might decide ranch life isn't for you, or you might get homesick and want to go back to town, or you might simply outgrow what this place has to offer. He paused, looking out the window at the mountains silhouetted against the evening sky. But here's what I do know. In the 40 years I've owned this ranch, I've learned to trust my instincts about people. And my instincts tell me that you're exactly the kind of person Frank Peterson was talking about when he said investing in people was the best investment a man could make. What if I disappoint you? What if you don't? Samuel countered. Emma, life is full of risks. The only way to avoid disappointment entirely is to never hope for anything, never try anything, never trust anyone. That's not living, that's just existing. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel could see her wrestling with a lifetime of learned caution warring against a deep desire to believe that good things could still happen to her. Okay, she said finally. I'd like to try, not just for a few days or weeks, but really try to make this work. I want to finish school, learn about ranching, and maybe someday be the kind of person who could actually run a place like this. Then that's what we'll do, Samuel said, feeling a sense of rightness settle over him like a warm blanket. Tomorrow we'll start making some phone calls about your education, and this weekend I'll begin teaching you the business side of ranching. As they said goodnight and headed to their respective rooms, Samuel found himself thinking once again about Frank Peterson and the chain of kindness that had brought him to this point in his life. Frank had seen potential in a young man who had nothing but willingness to work hard. Now it was Samuel's turn to pass that gift forward. Outside, the Montana sky was clear and full of stars, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. The ranch was settling into its nighttime rhythms, and for the first time in years, Samuel Morrison felt like he wasn't facing the future alone. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's arrival at the Morrison Ranch, and the transformation was remarkable. The hollow-cheeked, desperate girl who had stumbled through Samuel's door in the middle of a thunderstorm was gone, replaced by a young woman who was beginning to discover her own strength and capabilities. Her face had filled out thanks to Maria's excellent cooking and Samuel's insistence that she eat 3 proper meals a day, and the constant outdoor work was putting healthy color in her cheeks. More importantly, Emma was beginning to smile again. Samuel often caught her humming while she worked in the garden with Maria, or laughing at something one of the Martinez children had said. She developed a special bond with little Sophia, who had appointed herself as Emma's official tour guide to everything important in her 7-year-old world, from the best climbing trees to the secret spot where the barn cats hid their kittens. Samuel's phone call to his lawyer, David Chen, had yielded promising results. David had contacts in the state education department who dealt with unusual cases, and they'd identified several options for Emma to complete her high school requirements. The most appealing was a combination of correspondence courses and proficiency exams that would allow her to earn her diploma within 6 months while working on the ranch. The key, David had explained during his visit to the ranch the previous week, is that we're not trying to hide Emma or create a false identity. We're simply helping a displaced student access education through legitimate alternative channels. The state has programs specifically designed for young people in unconventional situations. Emma had been nervous about meeting with a lawyer, but David's gentle manner and genuine interest in helping her had quickly put her at ease. He'd asked careful questions about her academic background and had been impressed by her transcripts from her years in Cedar Falls, which he'd managed to obtain through official channels without alerting Robert Hawkins to the inquiry. Miss Rodriguez, David had told her, based on your grades and test scores, you're clearly college material. With the right preparation, I think you could qualify for significant scholarship money. Now, on this crisp October morning, Emma was in the north pasture with Jake, learning how to move cattle from one grazing area to another. Samuel watched from his position on the ridge above, admiring the way she sat her horse with increasing confidence. Jake had started her on Buttercup, an elderly mare with the patience of a saint, and the wisdom to compensate for a novice rider's mistakes. She's got good instincts, Jake had reported after Emma's first week of riding lessons. Horses trust her, which isn't something you can teach. She's also not afraid of hard work, and she listens when you explain things instead of thinking she knows better. Samuel could see that assessment proved correct as he watched Emma guide Buttercup along the fence line, keeping the small group of cattle moving steadily toward the gate that separated the pastures. She'd learned to read the animals' body language, to position herself where she could influence their movement without causing panic, and to work in harmony with Jake and his horse rather than getting in the way. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Samuel's attention away from the cattle operation. A dusty pickup truck was making its way up the long gravel driveway toward the house, moving faster than visitors usually drove. Samuel frowned, not recognizing the vehicle, and felt a familiar protective instinct kick in. Few people came to the ranch unannounced, and unexpected visitors always made him cautious. He rode down from the ridge and arrived at the house just as the truck pulled to a stop near the front porch. The driver was a man Samuel didn't recognize, probably in his 40s, wearing a sheriff's uniform from a county south of there. Samuel's blood ran cold as he dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Can I help you, Deputy?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice neutral and friendly. "I'm Deputy Ron Walsh from Cedar County," the man replied, stepping out of his truck. He was tall and heavyset, with pale eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the ranch. "I'm looking for information about a missing girl. Thought maybe you folks might have seen something." Samuel's heart was beating fast, but he kept his expression calm. "Missing girl? That's concerning. What can you tell me about her?" "Name's Emma Rodriguez, 17 years old, dark hair, blue eyes, about 5'4". She disappeared from her home in Cedar Falls about a month ago. Her stepfather's been worried sick." Samuel forced himself to maintain eye contact while his mind raced. This deputy was working with Robert Hawkins, either officially or as a personal favor. The question was whether he was simply following up on a missing person report or actively searching based on specific information about Emma's whereabouts. "Cedar Falls is quite a distance from here," Samuel observed. "What makes you think she might have come this direction?" Deputy Walsh pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket and consulted it. "We've been checking all the ranches and farms in a wide radius. Figured if she was on foot, she might have sought shelter somewhere. Course, she might not be calling herself Emma Rodriguez. Sometimes these runaways use different names." "You said her stepfather reported her missing," Samuel asked. "What about other family members?" "Far as I know, he's all the family she's got left. Her mother died earlier this year, and there's no other relatives that we're aware of. Mr. Hawkins says the girl's been having a hard time dealing with her grief, acting out and such. He thinks she might have run off to get his attention." Samuel felt disgust rise in his throat at this characterization of Emma's situation, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's a shame. Losing a parent is hard on young people." "Yes, sir, it is." Walsh looked around the ranch with obvious interest. "This is a big spread you got here. You run it all by yourself." "I've got a foreman and his family that live on the property," Samuel replied carefully. "We run cattle and horses, keep pretty busy." "Any chance your foreman or his family might have seen a girl matching that description? Sometimes folks see things but don't think to report them." Samuel made a decision. "My foreman's out working cattle right now, but his wife teaches school in town. If there'd been any strangers around the area, she'd probably know about it. Small community like this, word gets around fast." "I'd appreciate it if you'd ask them," Walsh said, handing Samuel a business card. "Here's my contact information. If anyone remembers seeing anything, even if it seemed unimportant at the time, I'd like to hear about it." "Of course," Samuel said, pocketing the card without looking at it. "I hope you find her safe." "So do I," Walsh replied, but something in his tone made Samuel doubt his sincerity. "Mr. Hawkins is beside himself with worry. He blames himself for not keeping a closer eye on her after her mother passed." Samuel watched the deputy drive away, waiting until the truck was completely out of sight before pulling out his cell phone and calling Jake. "Jake, bring Emma back to the house immediately," he said when the foreman answered. "We need to talk, and we need to do it now." 20 minutes later, Emma sat on Samuel's couch with her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. Jake stood by the window, keeping watch for any other unexpected visitors, while Samuel paced the living room trying to decide on the best course of action. "He said Robert was worried sick about me," Emma asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "That's rich. I'll bet he's worried all right, but not about my safety." "Emma, I need you to think carefully," Samuel said, crouching in front of her chair. "Is there any way Hawkins could know you're here specifically, or do you think this deputy is just doing a general search of the area?" "I don't know," Emma replied, wrapping her arms around herself in that familiar gesture of self-protection. "I was careful not to tell anyone where I was going when I left town, but Robert has friends everywhere. Maybe someone saw me walking this direction." "Or maybe," Jake said grimly from his position by the window, "this deputy is just going ranch to ranch hopping to get lucky. Either way, boss, we need to be prepared for the possibility that he'll be back." Samuel nodded, his mind already working through the legal and practical implications of the situation. Emma was 17, still a minor, which meant that legally her stepfather had considerable authority over her. Even if they could prove abuse, the process of getting her removed from his custody would take time and might not succeed if he had friends in law enforcement. "Samuel," Emma said quietly, "maybe I should just leave. I don't want to bring trouble down on you and Jake's family." "Absolutely not," Samuel said firmly. "Running won't solve this problem, Emma. If anything, it'll make it worse. Hawkins obviously isn't going to just let this go, which means we need to find a way to deal with him permanently." "How?" Emma asked. "You don't understand what he's like. He's smart, he's connected, and he's patient. If he wants me back, he'll keep looking until he finds me." Samuel sat back in his chair and studied Emma's face. In the 3 weeks she'd been living at the ranch, he'd watched her confidence grow steadily as she learned new skills and formed relationships with the people around her. But now he could see the old fear creeping back into her eyes, the learned helplessness that came from years of being victimized by someone who held power over her. "Emma, let me ask you something," he said. "What exactly do you think Hawkins wants? Do you think he actually misses having you around, or is this about something else?" Emma considered the question for a moment. "I think it's about control," she said finally. "Robert doesn't like to lose, and he especially doesn't like being defied. When I ran away, I made him look bad, and he can't stand that." "So this isn't really about getting you back," Samuel mused. "It's about proving that he can get you back." "Exactly, and if he succeeds, he'll make sure I never get another chance to leave." Jake turned away from the window. "Boss, what if we went on the offensive instead of just waiting for him to make the next move?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we started asking questions about Robert Hawkins instead of letting him ask questions about us? Small towns like Cedar Falls thrive on gossip. If this guy's been abusing his stepdaughter, chances are other people have noticed things, even if they haven't spoken up about it." Samuel felt a spark of interest. "You're thinking we should investigate him?" "I'm thinking," Jake said, "that predators like Hawkins usually don't limit themselves to one victim. If Emma wasn't the first girl he targeted, then there might be other people willing to come forward if they thought someone would believe them." Emma looked up with sudden hope. "Mrs. Murphy at the diner always said that Robert gave her the creeps. She never let any of the younger waitresses work alone when he came in. I thought she was just being overly protective." "See," Jake said, "there's your starting point. If the owner of the local diner didn't trust him around young women, other business owners probably felt the same way." Samuel was beginning to see the wisdom in Jake's suggestion. Instead of hiding and hopping that Hawkins would eventually give up his search, they could gather evidence of his inappropriate behavior and use it to neutralize his threat to Emma. "David Chen would know how to handle an investigation like this," Samuel said, thinking of his lawyer. "He's got connections with private investigators, and he understands how to build a case that would stand up in court." "But what if we can't find enough evidence?" Emma asked. "What if people are too scared to talk, or what if Robert's covered his tracks too well?" "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Samuel replied. "But Emma, I want you to understand something. You're not the same powerless girl who ran away from Cedar Falls a month ago. You've got people who care about you now, people who are willing to fight for you. That changes everything." Emma looked around the room at Samuel and Jake, both of them willing to put themselves at risk to protect her, and she felt something shift inside her chest. For so long, she'd thought of herself as a victim, someone who had to run and hide from the people who wanted to hurt her. But maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting back. Okay, she said, her voice stronger than it had been since Deputy Walsh's arrival. What do we need to do? Samuel smiled, proud of the courage he could see building in her eyes. First, we call David and tell him what's happening. Then we start making some discreet inquiries about Mr. Robert Hawkins and his reputation in Cedar Falls. Over the next 2 days, Samuel and David Chen worked together to put together a plan of action. David contacted a private investigator named Susan Rivera, who specialized in cases involving abuse and had experience working with small-town politics and corruption. Rivera would go to Cedar Falls posing as a freelance journalist researching a story about rural community leaders and their influence on local development. The key, David explained to Samuel over the phone, is to get people talking without them realizing what we're really after. Susan's very good at getting people to share information they might not otherwise discuss with a stranger. Meanwhile, Emma threw herself into her ranch work with renewed determination. Samuel had started teaching her the business side of ranching operations, and she proved to have a natural aptitude for numbers and planning. She studied the breeding records, learned how to analyze feed costs and cattle prices, and began to understand the complex relationships between weather, land management, and profitability. "You've got a good head for this," Samuel told her one evening as they went over the books together. "Most people think ranching is just about cows and horses, but it's really about understanding systems and making smart decisions based on incomplete information." "It's like a puzzle," Emma replied, looking up from the spreadsheet she'd been studying. "Everything affects everything else, and you have to think several steps ahead to anticipate problems before they happen." "Exactly, and that kind of thinking will serve you well in whatever you end up doing with your life." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Samuel, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever wish you'd had children of your own, instead of adopting Sarah and Michael?" Samuel set down his pen and looked at her thoughtfully. "Emma, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but Margaret and I tried for years to have biological children. We went through every medical procedure available, spent a fortune on treatments, and experienced more disappointment than I care to remember." He leaned back in his chair, remembering those difficult years. "When we finally decided to adopt, I thought we were settling for second best. I was wrong. The moment I held Sarah in my arms for the first time, I realized that biology had nothing to do with being a parent. Love is what makes a family, not DNA. Do you think Sarah and Michael feel that way too?" "I know they do," Samuel said confidently. "We never hid their adoption from them, never made them feel like they were anything less than our chosen children, and they never made us feel like we were anything less than their real parents." Emma smiled. "That's beautiful." "Emma, why are you asking? Are you worried about your own future as a parent someday?" "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "I was actually thinking about you and me, about what this relationship is becoming." Samuel felt his breath catch. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've become more of a father to me in the past month than Robert ever was in 5 years. You've taught me things, protected me, believed in me, and given me opportunities I never would have had otherwise. That's what fathers do for their children." Samuel felt his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. "Emma, I'm not trying to replace your real children," she said quickly. "I know Sarah and Michael will always be your son and daughter, but I was wondering if maybe there might be room in your life for one more." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand. "Emma Rodriguez, there has been room in my life for you since the moment you knocked on my door. If you want me to be your father figure, then I would be honored to fill that role." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Samuel looked out the window and was relieved to see David Chen's familiar sedan pulling up the driveway. "That's David," he told Emma. "Maybe Susan has found something useful in Cedar Falls." David came into the house carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of a man who had learned interesting but disturbing information. "I've got news," he said without preamble. "Susan Rivera has been in Cedar Falls for 2 days, and she's already uncovered some very interesting information about Robert Hawkins." "What kind of information?" Emma asked, tension evident in her voice. David opened his folder and pulled out several pages of handwritten notes. It turns out that Emma wasn't the first young woman to have problems with Hawkins. Over the past 10 years, At least 3 other girls have left town abruptly under mysterious circumstances. Samuel felt his anger rising. What happened to them? That's where it gets interesting, David continued. One girl, Amy Patterson, supposedly went to live with relatives in Texas after her parents died in a car accident. But when Susan checked with the school district, there's no record of her transcripts ever being sent anywhere. Another girl, Lisa Chen, no relation to me, mysteriously decided to drop out of school and move to Oregon to work for a cousin. Again, no official records of the transfer. And the third girl? Emma asked, her face pale. Jennifer Walsh. She allegedly ran away after getting into trouble with drugs, according to the official story. But several people Susan talked to said that was completely out of character for her. She was an honor student, never touched alcohol or drugs, and had college plans. Samuel's blood ran cold. Walsh, any relation to the deputy who came here looking for Emma? David nodded grimly. Jennifer Walsh was Deputy Ron Walsh's niece, and according to Susan's research, Deputy Walsh has been Robert Hawkins' fishing buddy and poker partner for over 15 years. The room fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. Emma had been right about Hawkins having connections in law enforcement. The deputy who'd come looking for her wasn't conducting an official investigation, he was doing a personal favor for his friend. David, Samuel said carefully, what are the chances that these 3 girls are still alive? Unknown, David replied honestly. Susan is going to try to track down their current whereabouts if any exist. But Samuel, we need to assume that we're dealing with someone much more dangerous than just an abusive stepfather. Emma stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains. Samuel could see her shoulders shaking and realized she was crying silently. Emma, he said gently, going to stand beside her. What is it? Jennifer Walsh was my friend, Emma whispered. She was 2 years ahead of me in school, but we worked together at the diner for about 6 months. She was the sweetest person, always trying to help the younger girls learn the job. When she supposedly ran away, I couldn't believe it. What do you remember about her disappearance? Emma wiped her eyes and turned to face them. She'd been acting scared for weeks before she vanished. She kept saying that someone was following her, watching her, but she wouldn't say who. Mrs. Murphy thought she was just being paranoid, but Jennifer was convinced that she was in danger. Did she ever mention Robert Hawkins specifically? Not by name, but... Emma paused, clearly trying to remember details. She did say once that one of the town council members had been asking questions about her, wanting to know where she lived, whether she had family, stuff like that. I remember thinking it was weird, but Jennifer made me promise not to tell anyone. David made notes as Emma spoke. Emma, this could be very important. Do you remember anything else Jennifer said about feeling watched or threatened? She said whoever it was knew her schedule, knew when she worked and when she went home. She started varying her route between work and home, and she asked Mrs. Murphy if she could change her shifts around. The last week before she disappeared, she seemed really scared, but she wouldn't tell me what had happened. Samuel felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. David, how quickly can Susan find out what really happened to those 3 girls? She's already working on it, David replied. But Samuel, we need to be very careful here. If Robert Hawkins is responsible for the disappearance of 3 other young women, then he's not going to hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in his way. Including us, Samuel said quietly. Including all of us, David confirmed. Which is why I think it's time to involve federal law enforcement. If these girls were transported across state lines, this becomes a federal kidnapping case. Emma turned back to the window, and Samuel could see her mind working through the implications of what they'd learned. When she spoke, her voice was steady and determined. I want to help catch him, she said. Whatever it takes, whatever the risk, I want to make sure Robert Hawkins can never hurt another girl the way he hurt Jennifer and those others. Samuel felt a surge of pride at her courage, even as he worried about the danger they were all facing. The frightened girl who had appeared at his door a month ago was gone, replaced by a young woman who was ready to fight for justice. Emma, he said, are you absolutely sure about this? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. Hawkins will know we're coming for him, and he'll do everything in his power to stop us. I'm sure, Emma said firmly. Jennifer Walsh deserved better than to disappear without anyone fighting for the truth. And if there are other girls out there who are still alive, they deserve to be rescued. David closed his folder and stood up. Then I'll make some phone calls to my contacts in the FBI. This is going to become a much bigger case than just one runaway teenager. As David left to begin the process of involving federal authorities, Samuel and Emma stood together looking out at the ranch that had become their shared home. The stakes had been raised dramatically, and they both knew that the peaceful life they'd been building together was about to be disrupted by forces beyond their control. But they also knew that they were doing the right thing, and that sometimes the right thing came with a price that had to be paid regardless of the cost. The FBI arrived at the Morrison Ranch on a gray November morning, their black sedans winding up the mountain road like a somber procession. Special Agent Patricia Gonzalez, a woman in her 40s with intelligent, dark eyes and an air of quiet competence, led the team that would be investigating what they now suspected was a multi-state kidnapping and murder case. Emma watched from the kitchen window as the federal agents parked near the house, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. In the 6 weeks since she'd knocked on Samuel's door, her life had transformed completely, but she'd never imagined that her simple act of running away would eventually lead to a major federal investigation. "You don't have to do this," Samuel said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Even now, you could choose to disappear. David could arrange new identity papers, and you could start over somewhere far away from all this." Emma shook her head firmly. "Those other girls can't speak for themselves anymore, Samuel. If I don't tell the truth about what Robert did, who will?" Samuel squeezed her shoulder gently. Over the past month and a half, Emma had become the daughter he'd never expected to have, and the thought of putting her in danger made his chest tight with anxiety. But he also knew that she was right. Justice for Jennifer Walsh, Amy Patterson, and Lisa Chen depended on Emma's willingness to confront the man who had terrorized her. Agent Gonzalez knocked on the front door precisely at 9 o'clock, accompanied by a younger agent named Williams and a victim advocate named Dr. Sarah Martinez. They'd been